Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. As we head into Christmas and the end of the year, now seems as good a time as any to do our dairy review. For this two-part episode, I'm joined by Teagasc Dairy advisors Jim Moyles, Ciara O'Shea and Seamie Nolan to review the milk and grass production and consider the implications of short weather shocks on day-to-day management in 2020. And firstly, Jim quantified the productivity in his clients' herds.
I'm dealing with approximately maybe 140 dairy clients across kind of South and West County Offaly. I can deal with 3 discussion groups, and I'm also involved in running a dairy startup course across the Midlands. In the main, my suppliers would be kind of Arbonne and Lakeland suppliers, a small number of suppliers for Clonbee and Centenary. And in terms of herd size, I think we're just a little over 100 cows on average, and the herd size among discussion group members would be a little bit higher. I looked it up there, I think it's about 130 cows is the average across the discussion group members.
And to you, Ciara?
So I'm based in the Macroom area, and my area would be quite heavy soils based, and I'd have about 160 clients there around with 5 groups, and they'd be all Dairy Gold suppliers, and around the average herd size for my clients would be around the 100 mark, or just slightly over it.
And to you, Seamie?
Yeah, I suppose, thanks, Emma-Louise. I'm unusual in that I cover the Roscommon, Longford, 2 counties. I'm only one dairy advisor for 2 counties, so I'm not in a densely populated dairying area. I suppose in that area, there's approximately, I suppose, 250 suppliers in the 2 counties. The range, I suppose, in cow size or in farm size is about from 20 to maybe 550 cows, is probably the biggest herd. The average, I say, is close enough to 80 cows, predominantly spring calving, with a bit of a history maybe of milking some late calvers throughout the winter. So most of the suppliers are either Arrivo or Lakeland, with some Arbonne suppliers.
So I guess when we consider, across the 3 areas that you're talking about, very much in line with the national average in terms of, the 80 cow farm and moving upwards as we're seeing the trend. In terms then of production, I suppose if we come to you, Seamie, what has this year been like in terms of milk production? Is it on par with 2019, or are we seeing more or less milk produced on farms?
I'd have to say it's kind of on average, it's more on par with 2019. I can't see any great difference. We examine this, I suppose, through the co-op performance report regularly with discussion groups. And the last time I looked at it, up until the end of August there with the groups, I suppose it varied between groups, I suppose, depending on what the makeup of the group was. But we say if you have a group with kind of what you call maybe settled farmers who are not in expansion mode or that, there's no great change in terms of milk supply. But I have other groups then that maybe are where there's a consignment of new entrants into it. And in some of those groups, milk supply could be up 15 to 20% in some of those groups. So it varies a lot depending on the makeup of the discussion group that you're looking at, really, I suppose. But on average, I'd say it's quite static, yeah.
And can you quantify the milk solids or milk yield produced on average on those farms?
Well, I suppose if we look at the Arrivo average and the co-op average, we say Arbonne and Lakelands for 2019, the average supplier supplied about 405 or 6 kilos of milk solids. But if we look at the suppliers in the discussion groups for those years, they were up at 430 to 450 kilos of milk solids, depending on which group you're looking at. So I would expect it to be similar to 2019 and talking about maybe 430 to 450 kilos of milk solids in the discussion groups.
And I guess when we consider milk production and the focus, where we put our focus, like we're all aware the currency for milk is the A plus B minus C payment system. So we're really looking at fat and protein in combination with a good milk yield. To you, Jim, what are the main drivers of milk solids that you see from your farmers? So, the farmers that are producing a good level of milk solids, what exactly are they doing to achieve that?
I guess it's not really rocket science, to be honest with you. One of the big drivers that we kind of KPI that we talk about within Teagasc and people will be familiar with is the 6-week calving rate, that has a massive effect in terms of the number of days cows will actually be in milk, So although maybe some farmers in their own eyes, they might have a cow that they feel she's a good milker or that, but if she calves into April or early May or that, she's never going to make up ground on the February calver, and unless you're prepared to milk her on over the winter, and that's probably not somewhere we really want to go. So to me, we've seen kind of over the last 5 years or so a massive increase in milk solids. I think around the time quotas were removed, we were looking at 350, 360 kgs of milk solids. That was obviously hampered by milk quotas. But now looking at figures there in terms of 2019, the annual figure was something like 417 kgs of milk solids per cow. So it's the days of milk is the main driver. Another big part of it obviously would be the national herd is starting to mature a bit, the extra young herds that Seamie talked about there, and new entrants coming in. There's maybe not as much expansion on existing herds, and cows they're beginning to mature a little bit. I think the average lactation, looking at a spring calving report this year, is now up to 3.6 lactations for cows in the herd. That's increasing year on year. But then again, one of the obvious things is improved genetics. I remember being a training day or a Zoom call with Pat Dillon only a few weeks ago, and he was at pains to state that a lot of this increase in productivity on farm, only something like 20% of it can be accredited to extra meal being fed on farms, and maybe extra fertilizer. They're the two things he pinpointed, that only 20% of it can be, like the other 80% is down to better genetics on farms and better technical efficiency. That the farmers deserve a lot of credit for the level of production, how they've driven on production per cow and total production the last number of years. So
I guess to take that point a step further, Jim, you've mentioned that, I guess genetics is accounting for a lot of gains that we're making on dairy farms. To you, Ciara, I mean, from your perspective dealing with farmers, are they seeing these results on farm as a result of, breeding for improved genetics and improved EBI, or is it just something we're seeing maybe at a research level?
Yes, I think farmers are seeing a benefit with the EBI. We have had groups there that have met with ICBF, and they have looked at their average gains of the yearly gains of their EBI, and it's approximately around €6 and going up to about 7.6 euros for the groups, and their average herd EBI across groups is around 137 euros there, and compare that to the Dairy Gold average suppliers at 109 euros. So there is gains being made and gains achieved there, and groups have kind of focused on, in terms of breeding for bulls, their kgs milk solids, fat percentages, kgs of fat and protein, fertility, EBI and maintenance, and they have put those as kind of good criterias for picking bulls. And this year that with the use of sire advice, which would have been a great focus that we would have had with spring groups, we pushed it out there to the groups of doing sire advice, and we had like a 10% increase in across some of the groups there with using sire advice. And like I do think it is making an improvement, and we can see there with the monitor farmers that the kgs milk solids that they have sold to the co-op to the 1st of December is 523 kgs milk solids, and then compare that to 2019 full year figures, it's 534 kgs milk solids. So in terms of the Dairy Gold monitor farmers, there will be a slightly ahead this year on kgs milk solids, I do think.
And I guess a really good point that you make there, Ciara, in terms of, the use of sire advice, and it's like a foolproof system, and it gives you all of the sub indexes that that are included in the EBI, and you can pick the perfect bulls for your farm, to create the perfect cow in your eyes? And I think, if the four of us here articulated the type of criteria we wanted, it would be slightly different. And that's reflected across, the various breeds and I suppose cow size that we see on farms. I guess from your perspective, Seamie, have you anything to add in terms of, I suppose, the benefits your farmers are seeing from EBI? Is it real on farm?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's one area maybe that farmers aren't always don't always realise how much ground they've made. And I suppose it's important to look at some of these things maybe over a time frame, like a 4 or 5 year time frame. Like as Jim has already said, like if we go back to 2014, 2015, the average kilos of milk solids in the co-ops was, down around 350 kilos of milk solids up this neck of the woods. Now it's over 400. Like the average gain, I suppose, of kilos of milk solids per cow is about 15% or more over a 4 or 5 year period. So that's nothing to be sneezed at, really. Like it's a significant gain. Like the other area which has improved a lot is the average 6-week calving rate. Go back to 2014, 2015. I know some of my groups, the average 6-week calving rate was down at 60%. Now it's up, just touching off 80% as an average. So those are significant gains, and definitely farmers don't always see it clearly, I don't think, when they're looking at maybe comparing one year with another. But if they go back and see or look at where they were maybe 4 or 5 years ago compared to where they are now, there's very big gains to be seen cumulatively.
And I think it's a really nice point. And if I know it's a broad figure, but some people will say it costs about €1,000 to keep a cow on the farm for the year, and the difference between 2015 and now is that 50 kilos of milk solids, that has a huge financial contribution to make to the farm. If we put a round figure of a €5 per kilo of milk solids, that's €250 of additional profit per cow. And as you say, Seamie, nothing to be sneezed at. Any further comments from you, Jim, on that in terms of the EBI?
Yeah. Look, I suppose Seamie just mentioned about some of the discussion groups and item groups, up over 80% as an average 6-week calving rate. But discussion groups only account for about a third of my clients. There's another 2/3 out there, and if you not to put a dampener on it, if you're to look at a national average figure, the 6-week calving rate is only 65%. So there's lots of room for improvement there. Look, it is moving up, but only very slightly, maybe 1 percentage point a year. One thing that I did note from a recent kind of report from ICBF, they kind of did a summary, the spring calving of 2020. They did a summary of the calving season 2020 in terms of the KPIs, and this year for the first time we kind of broke the 70% barrier in terms of heifers calving down at 2 years of age. So ICBF take between 22 months and 26 months as the kind of the target area for calving down heifers for the first time. And if you were to go back to, I just looked it up, if you go back to 2015, we were only at 59% there. So now we're up to over 71%. So look, the fertility figures, which is a big part of the EBI, they're a bit of a slow burner. It takes a lot more time. We've seen a more rapid increase in fat and protein percentages and overall milk solids, and people can measure them a bit easier. But there is still a body of work to be done out there, and there's no doubt or question about it. The EBI is a massive tool, and it's really transformed the industry. But we don't want to take our foot off the gas either, or get complacent about it, because it's we had a bit of controversy already this year in terms of maybe the genomics with some of the younger bulls and over predicting their fertility subindex and that. So look, it's a body of work, it's an ongoing body of work, and we can see it definitely is delivering for farmers, Emma-Louise.
And that's absolutely it. It's ongoing, and we need to keep on top of it and keep ourselves informed. I think, Seamie, your point in terms of reflecting is a really nice idea. And there are some really nice reports that give you a 5-year trend. So looking back over the last 5 years, where was your farm at? And I would say that a lot of dairy farmers will see that upward trend where they have seen incremental improvements, making leaps and bounds in terms of measurable performance. if we turn our attention then to grass, I mean, we did see that while there wasn't major weather shocks this year, farmers did get hit at times. I suppose, Seamie, can you give us an overview of where the weather was at this year?
Yeah, I suppose I have a bit of an interest in this personally, because I'm actually a rainfall recorder from Met Éireann here, and I record rainfall on a daily basis. So this neck of the woods has had a quite wet year. It'll go down as one of the wettest years in a considerably long time. We'll probably hit about 1,500 millimetres of rain for this neck of the woods, you know, which compares, like if you compare with, you know, the east of the country, which will, you know, it'll be 700 or 800 millimetres. Down south, it'll probably be, it'll struggle to reach 1,000 millimetres of rain. So definitely, we've had a wet year. Now, if we look back to where it caused the problem, I suppose February was an absolute washout. We had nearly a foot of rain in February. There was 260 millimetres in total. But after that, I suppose things improved quite well in the second half of March. We had March and April and into May were very, very good months. And I suppose in some parts of the country, you did hit a mini drought. Not to any great extent up here. Didn't really affect anybody to any large extent anyway. And I suppose looking at, I suppose the grass production figures for some of my fellas there that are measured in grass, there's no great difference between 2019 and this year. Some of them are up maybe half a tonne, some of them are down half a tonne, but the year itself has seen no great difference in terms of grass growth compared to 2019. As a follow on from that, then I suppose as we headed into the autumn time of the year, particularly October and November, we had quite a lot of rainfall here as well, with 160 and 170 millimetres of rain for those months, each of those months. So it did bring, I suppose, ground conditions got difficult quite quickly in the month of October and that. And in some cases, it drew the grazing year maybe to a close, maybe a bit quicker than people would normally like. But overall, I suppose I would have to say, and even talking to farmers over the last while, you know, at this time of the year, farmers often reflect on the year that was and how it was, and we'll take COVID out of it for a minute, but they will say that, you know, it was quite a good year overall, like from a grass production point of year and from a milk production point of year.
And quantify then, you mentioned that, you know, farmers are maybe a half a tonne up or down on last year. What sort of a figure are you talking about, Seamie?
So like you have a big range. The average lad maybe is growing maybe 13 tonnes or that, you know. So maybe he might be up to 13 and a half tonnes this year. Most people seem to be up a small bit. In terms of percentages, it's quite small, you know, but that's the reality of it, is about they're up maybe slightly, you know. Yeah.
And I guess to you, Ciara, you know, you've 60% of the rainfall, as quoted by Seamie, our weatherman. But I suppose, are there any weather shocks that stick out to you in particular on farms this year? And what sort of production did your clients see?
Yeah, so I'd agree with Seamie there that like in February it was like one of the wettest February's, I think, that was recorded. I know from the heavy soils farms that they were recorded, I think, around in the Ballinagree area, it was around 226 millimetres there. But I suppose I kind of, in looking back at groups, Google Sheet status and that, I suppose about 8% of the farm was grazed by the 1st of March. So across groups it was kind of ranging around between 0 to 10%, kind of like in my area where it's kind of heavy soils. And then I suppose like that was a struggle for farmers to meet that 1st of March target of 30% to be grazed when most of them were falling kind of you know, under 10% grazed, like so they had to try and catch up there, like, you know. And then I suppose in the main season, then they things started to become steady. It was good growth. There was some extra grass growing there, and I suppose in some parts of Cork, drought may have affected in places, but my area overall was quite good. And then I suppose in August things turned again, I suppose a bit wet again, and I suppose that affected the autumn grazing targets to be achieved by farmers there. And looking back on the group's data sheets, like, and that and pasture-based figures for groups, and that September for some groups there, September's average farm cover was coming in around 830, and then in October it was around 1,000 of an average farm cover at a stocking rate of around 3. So they didn't actually meet their target at, like, if they were stocked at 3, they'd want to be at like 1,150. So I suppose I did notice there with some groups, when we asked them kind of a figure there to kind of add up their meal figures, that they kind of were surprised that they fed a small bit more, but that I think was down to the wet February, and kind of the autumn is kind of where they kind of seem to have fed more. And I suppose there as well in the autumn, their dry matters crashed as well to maybe around 11-12%. And that had an impact as well. So I suppose the challenging times was the springtime with the wet February and the autumn time there, but like the main grazing season was steady and it was a good growth. And I suppose like with some of my groups there, I compared the 2019, there was like about 11.5 tonnes dry matter per hectare grown, and then 2020 was about 13 tonnes dry matter grown. I suppose there is variance in that figure, but a lot of it is down to there's a lot more farmers measuring grass with the push of the grass 10 group that I have. And I suppose that they have done a lot more grass measuring, a lot more walks as well. Like I have some farmers there that in 2019 might have only done around 20, but they're up on 35 walks now, you know, so that's a great focus there as well, you know, as well.
And I guess when they're measuring, Ciara, they're probably capturing a lot of grass that's growing. You know, the more regularly that you measure, you know, the more grass that you're going to pick up in terms of on farm, as opposed to, you know, every second week you're potentially missing peaks. I think it's a very fair comment that you make, and I think it's something that people saw across the whole country in you know, that rain in August really threw people. And you know, some people were in the situation where they were delayed taking out surplus bales, and also then people in some cases growth just plummeted, and therefore they didn't reach that peak that you're talking about in terms of, you know, what you're targeting at the end of September. And therefore I guess a lot of people ended up housing early. To you Jim, I mean, say in your area in Offaly again, was there much in terms of, I suppose, effects of the weather in terms of how people farmed from a grass perspective?
Yeah, I suppose, Emma-Louise, the kind of the two weather standout events for me for 2020 was, I think Seamie described it very well. He said a washout, it was the month of February, and the second event was a kind of a drought that came very shortly afterwards. Our local weather station is Gorgine Weather Station, and I actually looked it up around the time because it felt like it was raining every day in February, but they recorded 220 mils of rain, which is 11 inches of rainfall for the month of February, and typically they'd only be recording about 2.5 inches for that particular month. So from the deluge of rainfall in February, we headed into a kind of a month of March that temperatures were below normal. So it all kind of made for a very difficult start to the grazing year for farmers and that. So look, it's something they could have done without. But very quickly on the tails of that, we headed into April and May, and then there was very little rainfall. You know, we went from a kind of a feast to a famine, and that kind of created, I think Seamie used the word mini drought, but I was going to call it an early summer drought in the Midlands areas. I suppose it was probably maybe more pronounced in the southeast of the country, but definitely depending on, you know, if you were on lighter soils or if you had a higher stocking rate, you were feeling the pinch there in May. The big thing about, say, the drought this year was we had a second drought in the space of 2 years, so farmers were kind of throwing their eyes to heaven and saying, geez, we're not going to face into this again. But at least this year it was less severe, and it probably came a little bit earlier, and they didn't last as long. I noticed there in 2018 there was very good first cuts of silage taken, and then there was a bit of a job to try to gather up second cuts. This time round, the yields of first cut were very much back and behind, and that we've seen in cases in the Midlands here where second cuts of silage were actually heavier than first cuts of silage, and that's something you don't usually see too often. Just maybe bring it back to some of the discussion group members, and that we were, after lockdown, we were back on farms in July, and one particular group member that was hosting the meeting for July, he's on lightish enough soils, and he's milking around 140 cows or so, and he tried to calculate the cost of the summer drought of 2020 versus the previous year, which was more normal in terms of rainfall and climate conditions. So he actually worked it out there. He totaled up the extra meal, the extra silage, and he actually brought in a bit of zero grazed grass from outblocks to try to supplement cows, and it came to an extra €8,000 is what he totaled up. So 8,000 divided by the 140 cows, it was nearly €60 per cow, and when he worked it back, it was about 40 euros out of that €60 per cow was extra meal. But the really interesting thing, I suppose, it was he actually had done the same exercise for 2018, and he had the same number of cows in 18 as he had in 2020. But when he did the total cost that year was 24,000 was the cost of the 2018 drought on his farm versus the 8,000. So it kind of puts the two droughts, I guess, into a little bit of perspective anyway. You know, it wasn't near as severe, but at the time, now it wasn't too pleasant for dairy farmers, to be honest with you, to have enough stress and work without having to deal with you know, a drought in the summer. And it's not like, for similar to Seamie and Ciara on the call, we're a discussion group member, this discussion facilitators. You don't expect in the month of July, when you're sending out the worksheet, it was actually May and June this year that we had a column for silage to find out how much silage farmers were feeding. So obviously maybe the lower stocked farmers and maybe on heavier soils, they didn't get pinched as much, but definitely there was silage being fed that we could have done without. And just to finish out the year, I guess August then came very wet again. We got a mighty reprieve in September, and there was high hopes that we were going to get a good bag end and all would be forgotten. But unfortunately, rainfall reared its ugly head again in early October. And as Seamie said, definitely around the Midlands area, the grass year finished up a little bit earlier than we would have liked, and made the thing a bit more challenging. In terms of like the amount of grass growing, I'd say it's on a par with other years. You know, we caught up in parts. I know Micheál O'Leary from PastureBase Ireland, he put out a bulletin, a grassland bulletin during the week, and he mentioned 13.4 tonnes growing on dairy farms that had completed over 30 walks during the year. So again, I wouldn't have had too many farmers north of 13.5 tonnes, to be honest with you. I'd say on average they're back a little bit from that figure.
Just to jump in there, the Dairy Gold Monitor farmers are up about 0.4 of a tonne on their pasture-based grass grown figures as well.
And that's in comparison to 2019, Ciara?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting point you make, Jim. So what you're saying is Micheál's figures from PastureBase across the whole country is 13.4 tonnes, and I think that's very much in agreement what you're talking about from your farms, you know, Seamie, up kind of more northwest in the country at the 13 tonnes, and indeed Ciara down south at 13 tonnes. And I think again a point that has come from PastureBase in the past is, you know, regardless of where you are in the country, you can grow the grass. I suppose it's just to ensure that you have the grazing infrastructure and facilities there to utilise it. I suppose a final comment from each of you in relation to grassland before we move on. You know, we would have heard earlier this year, I think particularly around the time of the Teagasc National Dairy Conference, you know, there are strong signals from the Department of Agriculture that chemical nitrogen allowance on farms is set to reduce. I guess, where do ye see grass production going on farms? Can that level, and like, let's put the figure of 13 tonnes on average across these farms, you know, is that going to be maintained? Or if chemical N does reduce, do you see that we're going to maybe fall back to 12 tonnes of grass grown? We might start with you, Ciara.
Yes, I think that figure of 13 tonnes can be maintained. Like, I suppose, like with the introduction of, like, maybe introducing clover, you know, you can reduce your chemical nitrogen that way. Like, I have one farmer there that he has some clover set, and in his first year of setting it, he was spreading the same, and he realised he was doing the wrong thing. It was killing the clover, but he kind of went back to the 150 there of the chemical nitrogen, and he sees great response, and it grows as much as any other field there. And I suppose in my area there's been a great uptake with the low emission slurry spreading with the TAMS grant there, and I suppose farmers are seeing the benefits there with the extra bit of nitrogen there, about 9 units per 1,000 gallons that they're getting there. And then I have like another few farmers there that their soil fertility would be spot on, like they'd have their pH at 6.3, indexes would be very good, and they're in the main kind of season they're kind of targeting a unit per day in the rounds. So like if there was a 20-day round, they'd spread 20 units there. So like they're kind of ones there that I see straight away, like, you know.
And any further comment from yourself, Seamie, on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, at everything Ciara has said there is spot on. You know, the one, and I think it's an important point that she has made there in relation to a lot is going to be hung on the success of clover. You know, and I suppose maybe down through the years, clover maybe has got a bit of a bad name because it hasn't survived in swards. And you know, but Ciara makes a very valid point there in that a lot of the big mistake that was made with clover is that the amount of nitrogen applied to the clover sward wasn't reduced from May on, and that caused the clover to die out of the sward again. So I think that's a bit of a management change for farmers to get their head around, is that if you are incorporating clover into a sward, you must reduce the chemical nitrogen from the month of May, June on, to give the clover a chance to come and actually fix its own nitrogen. You know? Any
other key areas that will maintain grass production from you, Jim?
Yeah, you know, I wouldn't underestimate the challenge kind of facing farmers if like we've heard talks of maybe a 20% reduction in your allowance for chemical nitrogen. It's going to be tall orders to maintain the same level of grass production on farms. Before I'd go to clover, I'd actually maybe start from a different side. We were kind of involved there recently in delivering irrigation training courses to farmers, and the first step is probably to get more value out of the chemical nitrogen that's going out on your farms at the moment. And we talk about, I think, a term called nitrogen use efficiency, and what we would have been at pains to highlight here was the first step was to correct your pH, maybe through a farm liming program. Like for that, first of all, that's kind of relatively low cost, and it, unlike clover, it doesn't take massive technical ability, you know, on a farmer's behalf to bring his soil pHs up to the required level. After getting lime right, you're on to your indices. Ciara mentioned soil fertility, you know, working your P and Ks up to an index 3 or a medium. Okay, that's going to cost a bit more money and it's going to take a bit more time, but they'd be the kind of areas I'd work into, you know, through the use of fertilizer plan really to lift the amount of grass growing. Actually doing the lime and the P and Ks, if you were starting at a very low base from soil fertility, we were, you know, told that you could lift your grass production by 4 to 5 tons of grass dry matter per hectare. Okay, that's granted you're starting with a very low pH and probably index 1 for P and K, but there's massive potential to lift the amount of grass out there, because only a few years ago, I think it was only 10% of dairy farms were ticking the box for pH, P and K. I know that's lifted a little bit. The other thing in terms of, you know, about cut back on nitrogen, we would have been at pains again to state about the timing of a fertilizer and you know, not to be maybe blanket spreading the farm with chemical nitrogen in the first round, to replace some of this nitrogen with slurry and you know, maybe avoid the wetter or peatier soils till later in the spring when you're going to get a better response. And maybe when I talk about the timing of slurry, that goes hand in hand with having sufficient slurry capacity on farms. You know, we've seen you know, cow numbers grow on farms. I'm not sure we've seen the same growth and slurry capacity on farms, you know. And so to my mind, really we should be trying to, if we're going to be cutting back in chemical nitrogen, some of that's going to be replaced by slurry. Okay, people talk straight away about the low emission slurry spreading, which is fine, but we really want to be getting that slurry out maybe from February onwards. You know, people having to go in the first day that the open season starts in the middle of January is probably not good enough from my perspective anyway. So, but and I do appreciate that's going to cost money on farms. So maybe that's could be looked at. So these are areas I'd be looking at before I look at clover and the multi-species swards. There's been a lot of work Emma-Louise and research done in Teagasc and Salahead and Clonakilty and different parts and clover, yet the level of clover on farms is still very low. I think it's been estimated to be less than 5%. I think there's a big body of work to be done there to bring that up, both from on the advisory side, like the research has been done, but the advisory side and getting it implemented at farm level is going to be wouldn't want to be underestimated. The level of management required for managing clover is far higher, and the skill set required than managing perennial ryegrass. Perennial ryegrass is a lot simpler to manage, and we've been, we haven't maybe brought everybody where we want on perennial ryegrass, let alone be talking about how we're going to get lads up to the level that can manage a clover. So the clover and multi-species will be part of it, but I'd be picking the lower hanging fruit first of all, to be honest with you. And
I think there's some really good points made there. And
just on that, Emma-Louise, can I come in there for a second? I suppose it's important to point out that, I think it's a figure around 1,000. I must stand corrected on this now, but there's around 1,000 dairy farmers in the country that are doing over 25 or 30 measurements in the year. We still have a very, very low level of uptake of grassland measurement. That would equate to maybe 5 or 6% of if you take the 18,000 dairy farmers in the country, it's only 5 or 6% of lads are actually measured in grass. And I suppose that's are people going out and spreading nitrogen to grow grass that they don't really need, or don't, maybe they have a surplus on the farm already and they don't know it, and they're going out and spreading additional nitrogen to grow more grass, for maybe some of it to rot into the ground, so these are areas, I suppose, and it's slow progress in some of these areas, but there are definitely areas where there's room for improvement,
Yeah, I think there's some great points made there, and I think it comes back to the basics from what you're talking about. And people always talk about the primary step in terms of growing grass is to get what's happening under the ground in terms of the soil right, and it's what you're talking about there, your pH, your P and K, and then what's happening over the ground is that grass that you're growing. And a really valid point that you make, Seamie, and it's a challenge to put out there to farmers. A lot of people will say, well, I walk the ground, but I don't take note of the figures, or I make note of the figures, but I don't put them into something like PastureBase. And I guess, look, that's fair enough, and that's what you're doing. But at the same time, there is potential that you're growing too much grass and you're essentially wasting it. So that nitrogen might not necessarily be needed. The low emission slurry spreading and the white clover has also come up, and they're things that will help farmers in terms of getting better value from the nitrogen in slurry, and also looking at clover in terms of its nitrogen fixation properties. That's it for part 1 of the review of the dairy farming year, and my thanks to Jim Moyles, Ciara O'Shea and Seamie Nolan for joining me. Join us next week for part 2 when we continue our review, looking at the profit on dairy farms in 2020 and how farmers and industry alike coped with the challenge that COVID-19 presented throughout 2020. We at the Dairy Edge wish you all a very happy Christmas and every good wish for 2021. And we thank you for your continued support tuning into the Dairy Edge podcast each week. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.